Hey, this is Travis Human. This is my informative speech, and here's my audience. Who. One question, no real answer. This is the biggest question associated with Jack the Ripper. For years, his true identity has been debated by researchers and ordinary people. Jack the Ripper is the best known name given to an unidentified serial killer around the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. The two other names used for the killer were the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron. To figure out where the name Jack the Ripper comes from, you don't have to search very hard. The name came from a letter written by the person claiming to be the murderer. The letter was later believed to be a hoax. His attacks typically involved female prostitutes from the slums whose throats were cut before abdominal mutilation. He also removed internal organs from at least 3 of his victims, which led people to believe that he possessed anatomical or surgical knowledge. The first letter that was sent by the supposed killer was called the Dear Boss letter. It was postmarked and received by the Central News Agency in London on September 27, 1888. Part of the letter read, "Clip the lady's ear off." This part of the letter led police to believe that the letter was indeed true, since just 3 days later they found the body of Catherine Eddowes with one earlobe severed. There were said to be over 700 letters received by October 20th, 1888. These letters ranged from information on who the murderer might be, how to apprehend him, or information that might actually help the police bring the killer to justice. There are a couple other notable letters that were believed to be written by Jack the Ripper. The Saucy Jack postcard, the From Hell letter, and the Golston Street graffito are 3 of the more famous ones. Since there were a large number of attacks against women in the East End era, it is still uncertain how many victims were killed by Jack the Ripper. Experts came to the conclusion that Jack the Ripper victims had deep throat slashes, abdominal and genital area mutilation, removal of internal organs, and progressive face mutilations. Between April 3, 1888 and February 13, 1891, 11 separate murders were part of an investigation done by the London Metro Police Service. These murders were known as the Whitechapel murders. Different researchers have different opinions on whether all of these were done by Jack the Ripper, but 5 of the 11 murders known as the Canonical Five are believed to be the work of the Ripper. The first 2 cases listed in the file for the Whitechapel murders, those of Emma Elizabeth Smith and Martha Tabram, are not included in the Canonical Five. These 2 murders were initially believed to be the work of the Ripper, but most authors and researchers believe that they are not related. Emma Elizabeth Smith's murder is believed to be done by a gang. Out of the entire Jack the Ripper murders, there are 5 that stand out and are the most famous. These are called the Canonical Five. The 5 victims are Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. These murders were done at night, on or close to a weekend. The murders became more severe as they proceeded. Nichols is believed to be the first of Canonical Five victims. Her body was discovered at 3:40 a.m. on Friday, August 31st, 1888. Her throat was severed deeply by 2 cuts, and her abdomen was partially ripped open by a deep, jagged wound. There were several other incisions on her abdomen, which were done by the same exact knife. The second victim was Chapman. She was found at 6 a.m. on Saturday, September 8, 1888. Just like Nichols, her throat was severed by 2 cuts and her abdomen was slashed open. Later it was discovered that her uterus had been removed. Some stories say that there is said to be a witness that saw a dark-haired man with Chapman around 5:30 a.m. Both Stride and Eddowes were killed on Sunday, September 30th, 1888. Early in the morning. Stride's body was found at roughly 1 a.m., with Eddowes' body being found 45 minutes later. Stride was killed by the signature Ripper cut, a deep slash to the neck. But with the lack of mutilations to the abdomen, some people believe that it wasn't the work of the Ripper. Witnesses who saw Stride earlier that night give different descriptions on what the man she was with looked like. Just like Stride, Eddowes was killed with a slash to the throat, but unlike Stride, her abdomen was ripped open by a long, deep, jagged wound. These 2 murders would later be called the double event. Kelly's body was the most mutilated out of the 5 canonical victims. She was found at her home at 10:45 on Friday, November 9, 1888. Just like most of the other victims, her throat was severed, but this time down to the spine, and her abdomen had been emptied of its organs. Kelly has been considered to be Jack the Ripper's final victim, and it is assumed the crimes ended because the Ripper either died, was imprisoned, or immigrated. Even though Kelly is considered to be the last victim, the Whitechapel murder file does detail another 4 victims that were killed after the canonical 5. Rose Mylett, Alice McKenzie, the Pinchin Street Torso, and Frances Cole. Mylett was found strangled on December 20th, 1888. Since there was no sign of struggle, police believe she may have accidentally choked herself or committed suicide. With that conclusion, some people think that Jack the Ripper wasn't the person who committed this crime. Mackenzie was killed on July 17, 1889. She was killed by a slash to the left carotid artery. Thomas Bond, one of the examining pathologists, believed this to be a murder committed by the Ripper, though George Bagster Phillips, who examined the previous 3 victims, disagreed. Later writers also disagree on whether the Ripper was behind this murder. The Pinchin Street torso was a head and legless torso of a woman found on September 10, 1889. The police figured the murder had been committed somewhere else and the body was just dumped where it was found. Coles was killed on February 13, 1891. Her throat had been slashed just like most of the other Ripper victims, but her body was not mutilated. James Thomas Sadler, who had been seen with her that night, was arrested by police and charged with the murder. He was briefly thought to be Jack the Ripper. However, due to lack of evidence, he was discharged from court on March 3rd. The surviving police files in the Whitechapel murders are from the Victorian era. A team of policemen conducted a house-to-house search throughout Whitechapel. Forensic material was collected and examined. Then the suspects were identified, traced, and examined. They continued to be suspects or were eliminated from the hunt. There were over 2,000 people interviewed, with more than 300 people investigated. On the other hand, only 80 people were detained. Over 20 different inspectors were involved in this case. Since most of the killings occurred on a weekend and were all within a few streets of each other, this indicated that the Ripper was probably employed during the week and was a local of Whitechapel. Other people have thought they may have been a doctor who traveled to Whitechapel for a better job. Many suspects have been proposed after years. These have included anyone remotely connected to the case by documents as well as names. Since everyone who was alive at the time of the murders is now dead, authors accuse anyone. Despite all the varied theories about the identity and profession of Jack the Ripper, authorities and researchers have never been able to completely agree on a single killer, and the number of named suspects has topped the 100 mark. All in all, Jack the Ripper is one of the most famous unnamed murderers of all time. His killings were brutal and gruesome for the most part. There are many different theories on who the actual killer is, but researchers have never been able to put an exact name to the Ripper, even though some have claimed they solved the mystery. From letters to the murders to the investigation and suspects, Jack the Ripper is truly one interesting topic.